Hunger. Why are so many people going hungry in the UK today in 2023? Especially children in families where they got a brother and a sister. Precarity. Why is it so hard to get a house now, to get a home, when our parents and our grandparents didn't find it that difficult? Waste. Why are we wasting so much of our lives doing jobs we don't enjoy, which often don't make people's lives better? And exploitation. Why do we live in a country where we spend so much money on education, dividing our children, rather than bringing them together? What's gone wrong? Why is it like this? Up until I was 6, I lived in a house between a cemetery and a shopping centre, in a time and a place of full employment where people had never had it so good. Britain had never been as equal. Car workers lived in houses which are now prized by university academics. Even those who faced the worst discrimination had never had life chances that had improved as much. But a shattering had already quietly begun. Decisions were made in London that would close shipyards in Belfast, on the Clyde and on the Tyne. The boys in my school year would be the last to ever be taken on in large numbers to work in the car factories in the city of Oxford. What began then has never ended. When you're an academic in Britain, you have to move around. I moved to Newcastle in 1986 into a shattered city. I moved to Bristol in 1996, where redevelopment of the docks was beginning. But it looked like gentrification on shaky ground to me. In the year 2000, I moved to Leeds, where finance was booming, but hardly anyone was actually benefiting. In 2003, I moved to Sheffield into a city split apart, where what was left of wealth was sitting frightened, huddled on the Westward Hills. I returned to Oxford in 2013. I was shocked to see how few children there now were, how few young adults who weren't students. The students were more awake. More were from state schools than before. But they wore their gowns in the streets with a confidence that shocked me. When I was growing up here in the 1980s, the Bullingdon Club were at their height, wrecking restaurants, throwing wine glasses from windows such as the ones above me. They were increasingly confident. Inequality was growing then. The new world was going to be theirs. I thought all this would come to an end. I thought it couldn't carry on like this. But inequality grew and grew and grew. Now, though, it's on a plateau. Now the students of the University of Oxford are much less sure about what their future's going to be. But they live in a city where you don't have to worry anymore about wearing a gown in public, because there's nobody to look at you as if you're strange. I'm not pessimistic when it comes to global trends. It's just that the statistics are a great deal less rosy closer to home. Other nations have managed to avoid taking the path that we have taken. In the UK, capitalism has taken on a particularly cynical form. This has resulted in income inequalities rising and rising and rising to be almost the highest in all of Europe. In fact, by 2022 or 2023, we may now be the most unequal country on the continent. In the early 1970s, people were well paid. There was near full employment. They could tell their boss to shove it and get another job if they didn't like where they were working. However, 1973 does mark the end of a period of social progress. There were many strikes then, but the strikes were being held fundamentally to try to hold a line, to try to preserve what it was that had been won. At a private dinner in Hampshire in 2002, Margaret Thatcher was asked what her greatest achievement had been. She replied, Tony Blair and New Labour. We forced our opponents to change their mind. The invisible walls separating areas grow higher and higher. But we are repeatedly told the walls don't really exist, that there is opportunity for everyone out there. Lip service is being paid to levelling up, even as most people are being beaten down. A peculiar map emerges as a result, a geography of places of decaying fortunes, encroaching on enclaves of success. Those enclaves are found in the most affluent streets of London, in a few pockets of riches in Oxford, in the country retreats in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, but also in a few of the neighbourhoods now around the roundabout where I grew up. In my childhood, the affluent were more evenly geographically spread out. Today, no area of affluence is far from a place that is going bankrupt. Why is that? Well, in France, they spend 55% of GDP on public services. In the UK, only 41%. Let's talk about hunger. There never was a golden age, but when inequalities were falling, a virtuous circle began to emerge. Things got better and better. In the 1950s and 60s, building on the achievements of the late 1940s, the desire, the aim, the wish to eradicate want, squalor, idleness, ignorance and disease, we began to see the food banks disappear. People's wages allowed them to buy the food they need. Benefits were increased to a point where you were not in absolute destitution. But then we began to lose all this from the late 1970s onwards, right through the 1980s, right through the 1990s. Things really didn't improve in the 2000s either. By the summer of 2022, 36% of all UK households were suffering severe financial hardship. By the autumn of 2022, that had risen to 38% of all households. By the summer of 2023, 2 million households in Britain were unable to buy enough food to eat a month, such that they went hungry 2 or 3 days every month. We have not seen statistics like this for decades and decades and decades. How did this happen? It's often said that under New Labour, poverty fell, things were made better. But actually, inequality did not fall in any year by 1% or rise by 1% under Labour. The inequality that the Conservatives had engineered and created was kept at a high. And so the real levels of poverty, the actual material conditions of people didn't improve. The need for food banks didn't disappear. In fact, more food banks came every year while Labour were in power. destitution rose. And then, when the Conservatives and the Liberals took power in 2010 and enacted austerity, the situation rapidly became worse and worse and worse. By moving so far to the political right, New Labour pushed the Conservatives even further to become one of the most right-wing governments in all of Europe. When they came into power in 2010, they could enact the most terrible policies of increasing suffering on people because that was their political position. They, of course, said that there was no alternative to austerity, that nothing could be done, that the prices of food just had to rise, people just had to be poor and try and work their way out of it. But that wasn't the case on the rest of the European continent. In the rest of Europe, when things get bad, you begin to control the price of food. You set minimum levels above which prices cannot rise for basics so that everybody can afford to eat and they need not go hungry and they don't have to beg for food. In Greece, they even set a minimum price for your coffee on the beach or a cheese toastie. It's not just in Greece or in Germany or in France or in Italy or in Spain where you can enact policies to reduce suffering. In 2021, the special Scottish child payment was introduced, where for families which were reliant on any form of benefit, extra money would be received each week. In November 2022, that payment was increased to £25 a week for any child up to the age of 16. 2 out of 7 of all children in Scotland had their conditions improved such that by the winter of this year, by the winter 2023, a family of 3 children aged 16 or under will receive almost £4,000 extra a year, not reduced by means testing. No child in Scotland need go hungry now. No child in Scotland need go cold. But this isn't even reported in England, because in England the ethos is, if you are poor, you must suffer. Conservatives are always trying to distract people from talking about inequality, from thinking of it as a problem. Occasionally, they suggest that they're doing something about it, like the sick joke of levelling up. But constantly now we're getting new stories, new anecdotes. I learnt last winter that babies were being washed in the city of Oxford only ever in cold water because there were families that could no longer afford to have the heating on at all. I learnt this spring that there are households in Islington which are now lighting their homes by candles because they cannot feed the electric meter. My job's got easier. I no longer have to argue that we are seeing rising absolute immiseration. People know that this is happening. They know things are getting worse. People know that the number of people who are starving to death is increasing. The number of people who have found their bodies putrefied because they died alone is rising. All these things are recorded, but no longer do I have to say this matters because people know it matters. Charities which provide food, which is very helpful in the short term, now realise that in the long term they are not part of the solution anymore. This has to end, and we know it has to end. In the 1980s, the right to buy was introduced. This was the largest privatisation in the whole of British history. It resulted in families increasingly being forced to have to rely on private renting to house themselves, in others being forced to try to buy at prices that rose and rose and rose. Some families are spending a third of all their income simply to have beds. At the extremes, this could rise to over half of their income. Homelessness rose, fear rose, precarity rose. Why has the cost of housing gone up and up and up? It's not because of an increased shortage of housing. It's not because of supply and demand. We have never had so much housing in this country. We have never built so much. We have never built so many extensions. We have more bedrooms per person than we have ever had before in our history. It is because of speculation aided by government policy, a policy designed to ensure that whatever happens, house prices should rise, that Britain should have the highest house prices in Europe, that London should be the most expensive city because they see that as the most successful city. But it doesn't need to be that way. Other European countries control the cost of housing. They have regulations on their rents, as we used to do. They ensure that there is a social rented sector big enough that you are not forced to try to buy if you possibly can. And that reduces speculation, so there is no point in buying the most expensive house you can, thinking it'll rise in value in future and you'll make more money. But government policy like that makes housing cheaper, and that is not what the government wants. In Germany, rent levels are controlled by national government. They cannot simply rise and rise. And if you pay your rent, you cannot be evicted. In Sweden, there are national negotiations to determine the levels of private rents. Again, they are controlled. In the Netherlands, government inspectors come round to check that the quality of housing in the private sector is good enough. In Vienna, huge numbers of people are housed by the local state. In Finland, the vast majority of university students are housed in incredibly high quality apartments by housing owned by the government. Our social housing was once the envy of the world. On the 15th of January 1989, we abolished rent controls. Since then, we have decimated social housing again and again and again. In just 5 years, between 1986 and 1991, a single British firm as the lead advisor were heavily involved in the creation of 25 enormous new companies. British Steel, 10 water distribution companies, 12 electricity distribution boards, British Coal, British Telecom, they were all created in just 5 years. If the mess can be created in that short amount of time, it can be unravelled just as quickly. When times get tough, the French can nationalise their giant electricity distribution company. The Germans can introduce €9 a month tickets to allow travel on all the trains. They can reduce air traffic by 49% as a result. The same kind of tickets have been introduced in Spain, in Italy, in Luxembourg. Public transport is free, as it is in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. All these things are happening elsewhere, and yet we are told somehow it cannot possibly happen here. It is not possible to properly regulate a profit-seeking private monopoly. There is no sensible alternative to public ownership of the things that we all rely on. Politicians often claim that Britain has one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe, but of course it does, because you cannot afford to be unemployed. You'll be sanctioned if you're off work for too long and don't try hard enough to take any low-paid job you can. The UK has some of the lowest unemployment benefits in Europe in relation to wages. People are forced into work they do not want to do, work which often wastes years of their lives, of their abilities, of their talents, of their time, doing things that involve, in effect, filching off others to maximise the profit of some firm in the short term, but things which do not make us all, as a society, better off. In France and Germany, people get to keep a huge amount more of their own time. 7.4% and 4.5%. People work far better when they're paid more equally and not asked to work so many hours. In contrast, in the UK, as our hourly pay has gone down in real terms, we have to work longer and longer hours. We are less productive. We have less time to do other useful things in society. In 2022, in a trial of the 4-day week in many, many firms in the UK, it was discovered that working fewer hours resulted in no detriment. Public spending and the rise in public spending has been less in the northeast of England since 2019 than in any other region of England. There has been no levelling up. Savings have fallen the most in the poorest neighbourhoods of cities. The average worker in the UK receives an income after housing costs which is lower than that of the average median worker in Germany, France, Italy or Spain. In all of the other large European countries, the median person, the person in the middle, is better off, has a higher standard of living than we do. We are not on the road to any kind of sunlit upland. We've been going in the opposite direction. When it comes to education, our schools and cities have become more and more divided. Good schools are associated with expensive neighbourhoods, but most people do not have the choice about which school to go to. Good schools are more and more associated with the most expensive areas. School choice becomes something which depends on your ability to buy or rent a house in an expensive place. In England, university tuition fees are the highest in the world. In Scotland, students don't have to pay tuition fees, just as they don't, or the fees are minimal, from almost all of mainland Europe. But in England, universities are increasingly becoming businesses established to exploit students both from home, but especially from abroad. The roots of educational exploitation rising can be traced back to the mid-late 1970s, when attempts began to be made to unravel the progress of the 1940s, 50s and especially 60s in providing good quality education for all. Today, our school children in the UK are the most educationally divided in all of the world. Private schools, despite their high costs and often lavish resources, are not actually better schools. Just as private healthcare is not necessarily better healthcare. But we have been indoctrinated into believing that if it is expensive, it must be the best. Around the world, attainment measures show that the best education systems are not ones which charge families for their children to study. The best education systems do not leave families, and especially students, in debt. A good education system is not one which encourages schools and universities to compete for students. Why do we charge our school children money for them to eat at school? Why do we make them wear uniforms when almost no other country in Europe does so? Our children are not better learners as a result. Ever since university fees were expanded, education for those aged 24 and over in the UK has collapsed. People simply don't have the time and especially the money to extend their education. There's an enormous amount of unravelling that is now required. But even the Conservative government realised in 2022 that it had to renationalise further education. In 1948, when we created the NHS, we didn't build a single new hospital. We simply nationalised what was already there. And we did it without a computer. We did it with typewriters, paper and pen. If we did that then, we could renationalise what we've lost now. By 1950, only 6 small countries had higher life expectancy than the UK, all with a combined population smaller than the UK. We had more people in better health than anywhere else in the world. By 2021, the UK ranked 37th in the world by life expectancy. We had fallen down and down and down the ranks. The reason wasn't the pandemic. Everywhere had a pandemic. We didn't have especially bad COVID in the UK. The reason why our life expectancy fell so low was austerity. In more equitable countries like Finland, they actually spend less money per person per year on healthcare. But the waiting times in their hospitals are sometimes measured in days and at most weeks, not months and years, as in ours in the UK. Last year, 1 in 10 people paid to use private healthcare in the UK, using up far more resources per head than anyone else. A very large number of doctors and nurses trained in NHS hospitals end up working in the private sector. By 2020, we had 515 private hospitals in the UK. Our austerity-related healthcare problems haven't gone away with the pandemic. Britain is going further and further down the ranks by health outcomes as our systems struggle to cope. The UK keeps on falling down the ranks by many different international measures of health. By 2022, 8.3 million NHS patients were being prescribed antidepressants, including children and teenagers. That is a rise of 22% since 2016. Between February 2020 and May 2020, the average incomes of the poorest fifth of households in Britain fell by 20%. By November 2022, we learned that women giving birth or shortly after giving birth experienced a maternal mortality rate which rose by 20%, mainly due to an increase in suicides. Everything is connected. During the pandemic, the achievement gap between children from the poorest fifth and the richest fifth widened, and it has shown no signs of narrowing since then. In December 2022, for the first time in its 106-year history, the Royal College of Nurses went on strike. In 2023, the doctors of Britain went on their longest strike ever. This affects some people much more than others. Homeless people are 60 times more likely to go to A&E than the rest of us, 5 times more likely to be admitted. We have all the resources we need to improve our health and social care. We have enough hospital beds. It's just that too many of them are private. We have the trained staff, we have the medicines, but we treat our staff so badly that they are leaving the health and social care sector in droves. Do we have the will to do what it takes to rebuild our health and care systems? Our old age may depend on it. Even those who currently jump the queue and go private will be better off if we could rediscover that will and rebuild. The increasing privatisation of our housing system, our school system, our university system, our healthcare, our social care system has increasingly followed an American model with the encouragement of US policymakers, all designed to supposedly allow the UK to once again take its rightful place in the world. The story that a failing state tells its own people is that soon there will be opportunity for all, that the sunlit uplands are just over the horizon. It's about to get better. This is a compelling myth, but it's a myth. And it doesn't have to be this way. When things were last this bad, in the early 1920s, we had no idea they could get better. It was not until 1935 that people in New Zealand voted in a government which introduced the world's first welfare state. the one we copied. Doing so has been amongst the best of what we ever achieved in the past. And we now know it is possible. We can do this again. A home for every family. A teacher for every child who is not exhausted and is not in debt. Care for those who are sick. Work that is rewarded and is socially useful. We have enacted similar policies before, and they were presented in both the 2017 and the 2019 Labour Party manifestos. These are policies which are already being enacted now, on the left, in the centre, and even by Conservatives in mainland Europe, by people who have some faith in the public good. What happens if the UK continues to shatter? It won't be the very poorest who lose out the most. They are already living in destitution. It'll be people like you who have something left to lose.